Hi everyone, my name's Sally Russell, and in this mini lecture today what I wanted to talk to you about was environmental management systems. But before I get on to the content of the lecture, I want to tell you a little bit about the background of this slide. So this artwork is taken from an artist called Chris Jordan, who's based in the US, and he uses imagery to illustrate environmental problems. So you can see in the background here light bulbs, and the number of light bulbs is 320,000, which is equal to the amount of kilowatt hours that is wasted in the US every minute back in 2008 from inefficient use of appliances, so computers in sleep mode and leaving things on standby. So it's a really effective way of illustrating some of the problems that we're facing and some of the things that we can do to overcome those. So getting on to the content of the lecture, what I want to talk about is EMS, Environmental Management Systems, and two particularly. So ISO 14001, which is the international standard and is used really broadly across the world, as well as the Eco Management and Audit Scheme, or EMAS, which is used more frequently in Europe. I'll then talk a little bit about environmental aspects and impacts, and this links well to the assessment that you have to do for this course. So your environmental audit links to environmental management systems. And then I want to talk a little bit about the limitations of these and some of the things that you might consider. So what is an EMS? Well, really, it's a way of managing environmental issues. So it's a formalised set of procedures to enable an organisation to control its impact on the environment. So this is coming straight from one of your readings. So it's really this way of managing environmental issues for an organisation. It's very much a risk management approach, and it comes from total quality management, which I'll talk about in a second. Traditionally, the EMS has been associated with manufacturing industries, but more and more it's being applied to broader organisations than that. So we see organisations in retail, health organisations, the university sector, really broad range of organisations from small to very large multinationals. So looking at this relationship between TQM and environmental management, we can see kind of the relationship in this slide between the two. So from the very lowest level, if we're looking at TQM, we might look at product recall. So when something goes wrong, we'll try and address that by recalling the product. On the environmental management side, it's the approach where we clean up after something happens. So we might have an oil spill and that is cleaned up. So it's very expensive and it's not proactive at all for the organisation. Moving up to a more early approach, we see end-of-pipe solutions in environmental management. So this is similar to end-of-line inspections that we might see in TQM. The most proactive, or the approach that's going to have the most benefit and the most cost reductions, the most value added for the organisation, is adopting a proactive approach. So looking at environmental management, we might see the adoption of clean technology and materials, eco-efficiency, which we'll talk about later in the course, and these sorts of management systems that are starting to address issues before they occur. And this really links well to the TQM and quality systems approach. So you can see kind of the hierarchy that we get both in environmental management and TQM. So some of the benefits of an organisation implementing an environmental management system is really the crux is the environmental performance. But it also allows an organisation, or gives an organisation, a tool in order to manage that. So an opportunity to measure and monitor environmental performance over the long term, address the impacts, as well as set targets of what the organisation might do. So it reduces the risk to the organisation of environmental degradation and the associated costs with that. So thinking about the previous slide, rather than having to address environmental issues after they occur, it gives the organisation the opportunity to identify the risk of that occurring and address it before that actually happens. We also see organisations being able to compete on a larger scale. A really good example of that is Walmart. So Walmart requires most of its suppliers to have an ISO 14001 standard. So to supply Walmart, there is that requirement. So giving organisations this ability to compete and supply to that enormous organisation. It also gives the organisation a greater capacity to meet goals in international agreements and environmental policies and plans. So this sense of respect and credibility that comes with this accreditation is another key benefit of the MS, and then the organisation doesn't also have to rely on those voluntary measures. So when we're talking about EMS, often it's synonymous with this idea of with this accreditation of ISO 14001. So the ISO 14000 series is a standard that covers environmental management tools and systems, and the EMS particularly is ISO 14001. So this provides a common framework internationally for organisations, and it is an accreditation. So it can be applied to any organisation. As I said, historically it's been applied to more heavily polluting industries, so those manufacturers and those sorts of organisations, but more and more we're seeing it applicable across a broad range of different organisations. So the differences or similarities between ISO 14001 and the EMAS system is that ISO 14001 is really a voluntary scheme, whereas with EMAS it's a regulated scheme and it's only in Europe. The ISO 14001 is a global scheme, so any country and at any phase of development, and any entity as well. Whereas the EMAS, we see it more applicable to manufacturing industries rather than the broader approach of ISO 14001. The ISO 14001 standard is also a guiding approach, so it's focused on outcomes, whereas the EMAS is much more prescriptive. So there are some key differences, but we might see organisations who have both, or organisations in Europe only adopting the EMAS. One of the key focal points of an environmental management system is this idea of environmental aspects as well as impacts. So an aspect is something that is anything that the organisation does, so an organisational activity. So it can be positive or negative. So it's making a product out of recycled materials, the examples here on the slide, or it might be negative, such as discharging toxic waste into a stream. The impact then, so the aspect is what the organisation does. The impact is any change that aspect or that activity has on the natural environment. So it might be beneficial or it might be adverse. And this environmental impact is due to the organisational activities. When we're looking at the EMS, it's very much focused on the environmental aspect, so the activity of the organisation, and then trying to reduce that impact. It's not necessarily, although it does identify those impacts, the focus is very much on managing those environmental aspects or those activities of the organisation. So that really is the activities where the organisation can have control. The idea of an environmental management system is very much on continual improvement. So it's very much looking at those incremental approaches to change. So trying to do small changes consistently over time and demonstrating through the EMS how the organisation is improving. So this idea of continuous improvement or incremental improvement. And the EMS is based on a cyclical process. So plan, do, check, act. So in identifying those environmental aspects and setting those goals, implementing that, measuring, monitoring, checking, taking corrective action if necessary, and then reviewing progress. And it's a cyclical process. So this idea of continual improvement, going through the plan, do, check, act continuously to improve the environmental performance of that particular organisation. Some of the key limitations then are that it's a standard for conformance rather than performance. So it's focused on incremental change and conforming to particular standards rather than trying to change the organisation or transform it to be more sustainable or look at a new way of doing business. So it's very much operating from the same paradigm and trying to get the organisation to minimise those environmental impacts rather than look for opportunities to perhaps have a positive impact. Very much focused on this incremental approach, which can be kind of a trap rather than identifying transformational opportunities. The second thing, which I mentioned just a second ago, is this focus on environmental aspects, which is focusing on the things that the organisational can control, so the organisational activities, rather than on the environmental impacts that that organisation has. So it's looking at particularly what the organisation can control. The relationship between environmental issues and health and safety is excluded from ISO 14001, so it's very much just looking at those environmental impacts and aspects. There's also really significant documentation required for an EMS to be implemented, and this makes it much more difficult for SMEs and small businesses to engage in the accreditation process. So often we'll see very large organisations having an EMS in place, and those smaller organisations, although they might be doing things that parallel an EMS, they haven't got the accreditation because of this cost and time commitment that's required in order to get the accreditation. And the final point is that disclosure is not required. So there is no requirement for organisations to publicly disclose their information about their monitoring and measuring. There is a requirement to demonstrate continuous improvement, but not in order to disclose those processes. In the next lecture, what I want to talk to you about is how an organisation might measure these environmental aspects and impacts. And that's really where we get to the crux of the environmental audit, which I'll talk about a bit more in the next lecture. Until then, see you later.